By a margin of 53 to 50, opposition parties voted to consider a motion of contempt against Ontario Minister of Energy Chris Bentley. And joining us now for the latest from the park, here's Maria Babbage, legislative reporter for the Canadian Press. Welcome back, Maria.
Thank you.
Well, this is a very close vote, but of course it's a very close House, and we want to just sort of get some of the background in place before we talk about this. What in particular triggered this attempt by the opposition to consider a motion of contempt?
Well, it has to do with the release of documents pertaining to the cancellation of two gas-fired plants. One was in Oakville, that decision was made in 2010, and another gas plant, which was already under construction, Mississauga, which was made about in the middle of the last election campaign. So the total cost is about $230 million to taxpayers, and that's the conservative estimate that the government's released. So back in May, a committee formed of a majority of opposition parties, party members, wanted to see all the documents pertaining to those gas plants. And the government...
Meaning what? What kind of documents?
Documents about how the decision was made, what were the negotiations with the developer, that sort of thing. Everything and anything to do with the gas plants. So Minister Bentley came before the committee and he would not produce the documents. He said that it would be a bad idea because they're protected by solicitor-client privilege, and it would increase the cost to taxpayers to release the documents early, in particular relating to the Oakville plant, which had yet to be resolved at that time.
When was the last time in this province a member of the legislature faced the possibility of being held in contempt by the legislature?
I think the last time was during the Ernie Eves, the Conservative government under Ernie Eves, when they introduced the Ontario budget at the Magna car plants factory.
Oh yes, they didn't do it in the legislature, they did it at the car factory.
Right, which people felt flouted centuries of parliamentary tradition. You always bring the budget in the House.
But that didn't go through.
No, it didn't go through. The Conservative speaker at the time did say that on the face of it, it looked like a case of contempt, but the Tories at that time had a majority government and were able to vote it down.
But I think, I mean, if you want to look for a case when somebody was actually found in contempt, we're going back, what, 80 years, 90 years, something like that?
I don't believe anyone's actually been found in contempt. There are cases dating back, I think, to Upper Canada years where people have not responded to parliamentary asks for information. I think there are a couple of cases that the Globe and Mail broached about where people were asked to appear before the legislature to answer questions, but none of them, or not either of them, were found in contempt. So
there's a journalist found in contempt, but that happens every day.
Well, I think he was actually brought in under a contempt charge, but he managed to spare himself.
He apologized. That was the end of it.
Yeah.
If the minister is, so we've established it's going to go to a committee. This committee, made up a majority of opposition members, takes a look at it. It's going to come back to the legislature for a vote. If it comes to an actual finding of contempt, what's the potential punishment for Chris Bentley?
There could be substantial punishments. He could be disbarred. He is a lawyer. He could face jail time. That's also a possibility. He could be, I think, stripped of his status as an MPP. So it's very serious. It's a very serious charge, and it also sort of it taints you. I mean, you're found in contempt of the legislature. That's the kind of a kind of charge that you know follows you everywhere you go.
Having said that, we know the opposition parties before the last federal election found the Harper government in contempt. They went to the polls. Harper won a majority.
Yeah,
this thing can backfire.
Yes. Right now, the matter is before the committee again. They have to wrap up their proceedings by November 19th, and then come back to the House with a recommendation of whether to find the minister in contempt, and if so, what the punishment should be. And then the House has to vote on it. In the federal case, they did that. The committee found that there was a case for contempt. They brought it before the House. But I believe the Liberals paired it with a non-confidence motion, which brought down the government before any punishment could be delivered.
I don't want to put you in a position of having to opine as to who's more right and who's more wrong on this, so I'm not going to do that. But having said that, you know, the opposition have said, we wanted those documents, we didn't get them in a timely fashion, that's why we're bringing this contempt issue forward. Do we take them at their word that that's all that's going on here?
I think I would take it with a grain of salt. The opposition parties, right now, we haven't had a minority government in a very long time in Ontario. I think it's been more than a quarter century. And the opposition parties are finally, after 9 years of the Liberal government, are finally able to flex some muscle. They're able to hold the government to account in ways they weren't able to do before. And this is one of the ways they can do it, is through these committees. So I think that, you know, there is some political motivation behind it. They do want to score points with voters because the gas plants issue is a very sensitive one. People do not like the fact that they have to pay millions of dollars to move plants, that a government, you know, one of those decisions, the 190 million decision, was made during the middle of an election campaign. So they see it as a partisan issue, and I think it's getting a bit of a partisan response as well.
Two things to follow up. Do you think the voters understand that both the Conservatives and New Democrats also agreed with scrapping these plants and would also have moved them, just like the Liberals would have?
I don't know if they do, because the opposition, it's been pointed out, but the opposition tend to sort of not talk about that point and talk more about how much it's going to cost taxpayers. But they did, and I recall being on the Conservative campaign bus, and I think Tim Hudak, just a day or two before the people went to the polls, said, absolutely, we will remove this gas plant in Mississauga. So it was something that all the parties agreed needed to be done, but on the opposition side, they say, well, we didn't make that decision in the first place. We didn't like it from the get-go. So you know, they feel it's more the government's fault than anybody else's for why they had to.
That is a difference. Now, the other little sort of, you know, at the risk of getting too inside baseball here, but when Dalton McGuinty does decide to leave the scene someday, one of the people being talked about as a potential replacement is, in fact, Chris Bentley, the energy minister. So how much of all of this trying to find him in contempt do you think is an attempt to damage a potential successor?
I'm not sure how much it is. I think on the flip side of it, the Premier's defense of Bentley, which has really ramped up in the last few days, is, I think, him thinking about the future of the party. Bentley has been considered a leadership candidate, someone who may succeed McGuinty. I believe Greg Sorbara really liked Bentley from the get-go, thought he would be a good replacement. So I think the Premier at this point is trying to help Bentley. I think there's a definite Save Bentley campaign going on now, because I think some of the caucus might see this as very unfair. This is a minister who didn't make those decisions. He's just forced to carry them out as a minister, and they feel it's very unfair to him. The Premier's right in saying that, you know, this is unfair to someone. It's very serious against a person who, you know, before entering politics, was an upstanding person, still was as a minister. But he's not really taking any of the responsibility for this, and he was Premier when those two decisions were made. And
the fact is, Bentley didn't make these decisions to cancel these plants, right?
No, he didn't. He wasn't energy minister until after the last year's election, so he had no hand in any of these decisions.
These were the Premier's decisions.
Well, the Mississauga plant, which was made during the election, that decision was done by the Liberal campaign team, which I would assume they would consult the Premier on any big decisions like that.
Well, they advise. He's got to make he's pulling the plug at the end of the day. Let's go here next. The cancellation of these two plants, the first one in Oakville for $40 million, the second one in Mississauga for $190 million. Why is there such a discrepancy in the size of the compensation that the government has to pay out to the two different companies involved here?
Well, the Mississauga plant was already under construction, so the government had to absorb some of the costs and pay the company for some of the costs of doing that. With TransCanada, which was the $40 million, that was the Oakville plant, the $40 million decision. That one was, the plant had not yet been constructed. There was a lot of local opposition to it. It hadn't yet been constructed. And this is the government's figure, but the opposition parties say it's actually much larger if you consider what the government will have to pay in terms of transmission and other costs that they feel the government is glossing over and not putting in that figure.
And by forcing the government now, they've got the Speaker made a ruling. The ruling was you got to bring those papers forward. I know you didn't want to, but you got to. What does the opposition now hope to find out that would have been considered so secret before by the revealing of these documents?
Well, they feel that there are a lot of omissions in the documents. They feel that some were withheld. Now, the government said, no, we didn't withhold anything. But they've noted, for example, the lack of any communication between the previous energy minister, Brad Douglas, any correspondence from him. And you would think that he would be involved in these decisions, that he would be, communicated with, and they don't see any of those documents. So they feel that they're going to be able to unearth more documents, and they also want to question some of the people who were involved in the decision. So people perhaps from the Ontario Power Authority, the Ontario Power Generation, and several ministers. They've also asked for the Premier to show, but he said no.
Is he allowed to decline their invitation to attend?
He is. He is exempt from any obligation to appear before a committee. He cannot be the subject of a speaker's warrant, for instance, which was what was used by the Public Accounts Committee to get Dr. Chris Mazza, the former CEO of Orange, to appear. So he can't be touched. Now,
I mean, it's an extraordinary thing for a Premier to appear anyway. I think George Drew appeared on a committee dealing with organized crime, but that's 70 years ago, and I think obviously Mike Harris appeared during the Walkerton inquiry. So it has happened, but what's the Premier's explanation for, if summoned, refusing to come?
Well, it's the same explanation he's given with the Orange Committee, which has twice asked for him to appear. And that is that they can ask him any questions they like during question period, and the media can ask him any questions they like when he's available to them. So he feels that he's done enough and he's available enough to be accountable for those decisions, and he doesn't need to appear before the committee.
Do ministers of the Crown have the same right not to appear if asked to appear?
My understanding is that they do. They don't have to appear, but many of them do because otherwise it would look very badly if they didn't. So, for example, Health Minister Deb Matthews has appeared several times before the Public Accounts Committee that's looking at Orange. Dwight Duncan, the Finance Minister, appeared at the committee that's looking into the gas plants issue, and so has Bentley.
Chris Bentley has appeared, and I think Brad Douglas has also said, the former Energy Minister, that he would appear.
Yes, he said today that he's going to clear up some of the misinformation about the gas plants when he appears. So, yeah.
Let me ask you about, there is a fundamental unfairness in our system, and we've seen examples of this before. I'll do a brief setup here. E-health. Most of all of the crap happened under George Smitherman, but then he left and David Kaplan inherited the position, and then it blew up, and Kaplan was the guy who had to fall on his sword. It's kind of a replay here, right? A lot of the bad stuff here happened under previous energy ministers, and yet here's Chris Bentley who has to carry the can. How much trouble do you think the Premier's in with his own cabinet and/or caucus because ministers are being sent out to sort of carry the can for stuff they had nothing to do with?
I think after Kaplan had to resign, I think there must have been some questions asked about whether that was appropriate. Now we have an example where another minister who has inherited a mess may have to pay the ultimate price for it. But it's not just a resignation. This time it's really serious.
He's not going to jail, though.
Well, I don't think so. I don't think the opposition.
Or even disbarment? I mean, would they go for
well,
that?
there's a number of penalties that they can recommend. It's still up to a vote. The House still has to decide, but they can recommend a lot of things that are pretty bad. With Kaplan, he was able to resign. It was unfortunate because he did inherit that mess. He wasn't, responsible for e-health. And I think that if questions have not been asked in Cabinet about that, they're at the table, I'm sure they're being asked behind closed doors because it is unfair. And I think that, other ministers have not suffered the same fate. Deb Matthews has not resigned as health minister over Orange. So I think that there is the Premier may be getting questions and getting some, maybe funny looks about letting Bentley take the fall for this.
Although at the annual general meeting they just had, he got, re-upped with 85% approval.
Well, I mean, Dalton McGuinty runs a tight ship. People, I don't see anybody overtly going after his job. I don't see anyone, making public their desire to become the next leader. Everyone's very, very careful about what they say, and for good reason. He's won 3 elections, and he seems to be the heart and soul of that party right now. But the approval rating aside, that's Liberal Party members that want to see someone who's known to have and has a reputation for winning elections at the forefront. They don't want to see a change. We could have a confidence motion over the budget. The government could be toppled. You don't want a leadership race in those few months before that budget.
Sure.
So.
The Premier trucked out an argument the other day, which I confess I hadn't heard before, and I'd like to get your view on how much currency this seems to have now. He said, once upon a time, then Premier William Davis canceled the Spadina Expressway, contracts were canceled, nobody was held in contempt. Bob Rae canceled the Red Hill Creek Expressway in Hamilton. Contracts were broken, nobody was held in contempt. Mike Harris reversed the decision to create subways in Toronto. They filled in all the holes that they'd already bored open. Contracts were canceled, nobody was held in contempt. Okay, here's a situation where contracts were canceled and somebody's being potentially and probably held in contempt. Is he making a good argument here that this is somehow the tyranny of the opposition against the minority government here?
Well, there are two things there. One is the comparison, and one is the tyranny of the opposition, or the heavy-handedness of the opposition, as he says, the majority opposition. On the first point, I think it's a fair comparison in that, yes, there were contracts canceled. There was work underway in the Spadina Expressway when it was canceled. But the opposition points out that, this is, with the Mississauga plant anyway, Spadina Expressway wasn't canceled in a campaign. It was canceled after Bill Davis was elected, and he made that decision, his government made that decision. So I think there's some details that perhaps the Premier didn't get into that he may have left himself open to. The second point about the majority opposition, I think he has a point that perhaps the opposition parties are being overzealous in their desire to get to the bottom of the gas plant scandal, and that Bentley could be, the one who ends up, in the line of fire for that.
The fall guy.
Yes, exactly. But at the end of the day, those opposition parties had more of the popular vote than the Liberals did. So this is a province that gave a minority government or elected a minority government, and he's just going to have to deal with the fact that the opposition do have a majority in the House.
Well, that raises my last question, just in our last half minute here. Do you think, through the course of all of this, the Liberals have lost some ability to govern?
I think it's shown that they have, although they've done pretty well so far. They got a deal on the budget. They've managed to do this pretty well. It's been a year, so they've done fairly well. But I think they have lost some control of the House. And I think it's raised questions about whether they are in control, whether they should continue as a government, because it seems that the opposition are finding ways to take that control out of their hands. And I think, McGuinty's behavior of late, where he's come to Bentley's defense, he really ramped up the rhetoric. He's, saying this is personal attacks. I think he does want to help his friend and his colleague. But on the other hand, I think that it shows, and this goes back to the budget as well, he sometimes overreacts a little bit. And that gets the backup of the opposition. So I think, after 9 years of governing, McGuinty's sort of, I don't know if he can play well with others as well as he should.
We'll see. Well, it's the anniversary today, isn't it? It's 1 year today?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, 1 year tomorrow. Happy anniversary. Thanks, Maria Babbage from Canadian Press.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.